And so the days went by. Whether she was yelled at by her stepmother, training in the courtyard with a sword under the critical eyes of her instructor, or sleeping in bed, Andreas was always by her side protecting her, giving her courage, and supporting her. The months passed, and the green trees gradually turned into golden autumn hues. Vivian called out for Andreas and asked where he was, mentioning that she was now at the agreed-upon position, just as she had promised him. She asked if he would teach her swordsmanship again. But Andreas hid behind the tree. Suddenly, he emerged from behind the tree and told her not to shout like that and that she should hit him since she had promised not to tell anyone about him. She quickly covered her own mouth. She turned around and realized that he was hiding behind the tree while Andreas continued to scold her. Then the two of them started their training. He tried his best to teach her everything he knew. Their training methods and her talent in swordsmanship truly harmonized well, and her progress was remarkable. She was truly a prodigy. As Andreas watched her, he knew that these movements couldn't come from someone normal who had only recently learned how to handle a sword. He told her that her movements were perfect and that she would often be praised for her swordsmanship. But Vivian pouted a bit and became somewhat ashamed. Andreas thought she was a truly confident child but now realized that in some ways she wasn't as confident as he had thought. He asked what was wrong because her movements had been perfect. Vivian then said that no matter how many times she was praised, Andreas had never personally shown himself to her. That surprised him. He didn't know exactly how to respond to her. He thought for a moment and told her the first thing that came to mind, that he was a fairy and that's why he couldn't do it. But Vivian said that it was probably because she was a bad child. She thought that if she did her best and he acknowledged her, he would reveal himself to her. Yet, she had to realize that even when she had tried so hard, he still hadn't shown her his true form. She asked him if her efforts were in vain and that it didn't matter how much she tried, he would never show himself to her. When Andreas heard this, he remained silent behind her and didn't say a word. Suddenly, she heard her father's voice saying that she had surprised him. He couldn't believe the amount of talent she had just shown. Her father then asked her to show him her swordsmanship again. Vivian was surprised but wanted to fulfill her father's request and immediately showed him what she was capable of and what she had learned. When she finished, she eagerly awaited her father's feedback. However, he went into the house without saying anything but still told her that what he had just witnessed was amazing and praised her. This bewildered Vivian, and she could hardly believe her father's praising words. She then spoke to Andreas and told him that this was the first time her father had praised her. She looked up, and tears were welling up. She continued, saying that she had never dreamed that something like this would ever happen. Andreas was also surprised and continued listening. Vivian said that she wanted to stay with him here but she realized that it was time to wake up. Andreas was happy that she would finally wake up. She said that it was thanks to him that she found the path to look forward to and move on. She also said that she wanted to continue the path he had shown her and no longer be stuck in the past. Andreas approached her slightly and crossed his little finger with hers. She was confused and nervous. He said that the promise she had made to him had to be kept. She then said that she would do so forever, and the dimension they were in crumbled in the background. Vivian's final words before the dimension finally collapsed and the barrier dissipated were words of gratitude to Andreas for showing her a good dream. Then, the barrier created by the black mage collapsed, and Andreas held Vivian's hand. In the ruins of the city lay the corpses that Vivian had previously killed in her bloodlust. However, Vivian slept and looked truly happy. Andreas held her hand and protected her, just as he had promised her in her dream. Shortly after, she also woke up, and Andreas explained to her and Ivy that Baron Balearic was the one responsible for the crime. In this place, Ivy managed to destroy the barrier she was in on her own and then reunited with the others. Ivy now wanted Andreas to cut off the butler's head. She became really angry and wanted to go straight to the Baron's castle. So they set off immediately. As Ivy discussed the next steps, Andreas looked at her and realized that her killing intent was very strong, which didn't surprise him since Christopher was dead and Hazar was missing. One of the Baron's guards fell abruptly to the ground as a sword narrowly missed his face. His comrades asked Ivy, Vivian, and Andreas who they were and what they were doing there, ordering them to put away their swords. Even after returning to the Baron's castle, Ivy remained as furious as she had been in the village. She introduced herself as Ivy Clare, assistant professor of Rodlin Academy's night faculty, and stated that anyone who defended Baron Balearic was guilty of high treason and would be executed immediately. With this statement, Andreas wondered if she was serious and if she would really kill them all if necessary. She then held up a head, shocking all the guards at the castle gate from a very inappropriate angle. She asked if they recognized the head, which obviously belonged to the butler that Andreas had accompanied and patched up with some rope. Ivy explained to the guards that the butler was responsible for what had happened in the nearby village and that they wanted to be taken to the Baron immediately. The guards were surprised but allowed our group to enter. The Baron's estate was truly beautiful and befitting of a noble family. Vivian was surprised and impressed by the surroundings. When they reached the Baron, he was already waiting for Ivy, welcoming her, Vivian, and Andreas. They were all very surprised by what they saw and couldn't believe their eyes. The Baron recognized that Evan was dead and pointed to his son, Adele, who was a large mutated mass of flesh. The Baron explained that his son was supposed to die from an illness a few months ago. So the Baron explained that he had told this man to do whatever it took to help his son, even if it meant living in such a miserable state as he did now. He pointed to his fleshy son, who was crying and obviously in pain and no longer wanted to live. Ivy became angry and still couldn't believe what she was seeing. The Baron turned to his son and fell to his knees in front of him. He begged his son for forgiveness and, in hindsight, didn't find his decision as good anymore. Ivy drew her sword, took a few steps forward towards the Baron and his son, and grabbed the Baron by the collar. She forcefully threw him backward and told him that he should ask forgiveness from the people he and his butler had killed. The guards who had witnessed everything asked if the Baron was still alive as he tried to get up after the throw. Ivy turned around and asked the guards why they were standing around like fools, ordering them to call the investigation team and eliminate the monster in the background. The guards understood and intended to follow the order. Suddenly, a sharp stone spear formed in Andreas' hand, which he threw forward with all his might, to the surprise of Vivian and the Baron. Ivy was also taken aback when the spear struck the Baron's son directly in the face, causing him to die. The Baron couldn't believe that his son had been killed, and he screamed his name throughout the entire castle. As he witnessed the spear piercing his son, even the guards were shocked by the screams of their former Baron. Completely stunned, the Baron went to the body of his son and touched it, while Vivian and Ivy watched silently. Ivy then turned to Andreas and asked him what that was all about and why he acted without an order. In response to this question, Andreas stated that a creature created from black magic had to be eliminated immediately before it could act and endanger others. Furthermore, the only important information they needed was in the hands of the Baron, and he asked Ivy if he was wrong about that. Shortly thereafter, the Imperial investigation team arrived, arrested the Baron, and took the disgustingly grotesque mass of flesh, his son, with them. After Andreas, Ivy, and Vivian returned to the academy, they were immediately questioned by the Imperial investigation team and had to testify as witnesses about what had happened. They had enough evidence, and it was clear to them that the Baron had collaborated with a black mage. They told Andreas and Vivian that the Baron should be brought in immediately, and another meeting would be held afterward. The investigation team thanked them for their time and told them that they could now go home. Andreas and Vivian then left the interrogation room, and Andreas knew that the consequences for Baron Balearic, for dabbling in black magic, would surely be severe. He turned around and thought that even though the Baron would probably be angry with him at the moment, he should thank him instead. If he hadn't killed his son, he would have suffered much greater pain. Now he would surely be used as an experimental subject by a group of deranged mages who had no good intentions for him. Andreas suddenly widened his eyes as Vivian addressed him as Mr. Fairy, and asked if he had planned everything. He turned around and asked her what she meant by fairy, and what they were talking about, realizing that he was so lost in thought that he almost spoke just like the fairy. Vivian recognized the voice of her fairy and said that he sounded just like it. Suddenly, Lucia called out Andreas' name and ran to him from behind. She asked him if he was done with the investigation team meeting, which Andreas confirmed. Lucia held up her tablet and desperately wanted to show him something. She explained to Andreas that he had recently become a little celebrity and showed him an article about students defeating a black mage with an investigation conducted by the Imperial. It mentioned casualties and missing persons involved. Lucia was about to mention that it had only been a short time since they introduced their new potion when Andreas interrupted her and explained that he actually just wanted some peace and quiet. However, Lucia ignored his comment and told him that she had heard he would receive a reward, so he should invite her to dinner. However, Andreas explained to her that he wouldn't do that because the reward for the potion would be shared anyway, so she would have her own share. He was surprised that she didn't even try to get a free meal out of it. Lucia noticed that there was someone else standing beside Andreas and asked him if she was the person mentioned in the report as well. He asked Lucia if she had only just noticed her and introduced Vivian to her. Both of them bowed and exchanged names while Andreas apologized for Lucia's frantic behavior. Lucia then wanted to bring up the topic of the reward again. She explained to him that she wanted him to invite her to celebrate the success of the potion. However, he asked her why she insisted on him inviting her to dinner when she was so rich and had much more money than he did. Suddenly, a voice echoed in the room, and both of them were genuinely shocked. They heard the voice, their eyes widening. The voice said that they were very bold entering the tower so casually and without any nerves. Andreas recognized the voice but couldn't believe that it was really the voice he remembered. In an instant, without the two even having a chance to react, a man with a blindfold and a large eagle on his shoulder appeared behind them and firmly held onto their shoulders. Andreas and Lucia turned around slightly to get a better look at the man who had suddenly appeared behind them and realized that it was Bard Alvin, the owner of the Rodlin Magic Tower. The guard who was leading Lucia and Andreas through the tower turned around and was surprised when she saw Tower Master Bard Alvin. A large eagle perched on his shoulder, and a brown cloth covered his eyes. His eagle soared high as Bart looked around at Lucia and Andreas. He recognized Andreas' face and noticed that it hadn't changed at all. Bart was the head of the Alvin family and the current Tower Master of Rodlin. Andreas wondered about Bart's presence and contemplated whether his personal presence could disrupt the balance. After scrutinizing Andreas, it was Lucia's turn, and Bart immediately recognized her as the daughter of Count Hollington. Lucia bowed politely, confirming Bart's assumption, and introduced herself as Lucia Everlast. Bart then thought to himself that one would only remember names if they had built a certain reputation. Andreas and Lucia were astonished that Bart had spoken out loud and wondered if they had just heard that statement. Bart extended his arm and informed the guard who had been leading them around that he would now take over. Using his magic, he created an orange whirlpool beneath him. The guard accepted that the Tower Master wanted to personally guide them. Andreas couldn't believe that Bart was using this kind of magic. The whirlpool expanded upward, completely encircling Andreas and Lucia. In response, Lucia asked him if he also thought that Bart was a monster for effortlessly using such complex and powerful spatial magic. She also thought that he was intentionally exaggerating to show off in front of them. Bart responded with a grin, stating that he could hear their whispers just fine. The magic grew more intense and powerful until it reached its maximum. Then, Bart, Andreas, Lucia, and the guard disappeared, teleporting into a room before a committee consisting of 3 elderly gentlemen, all wearing dark mage robes. When the group suddenly appeared before them, the elderly gentlemen were quite surprised to find the Tower Master among them. Bart asked the elderly gentleman if the investigation of the potion was still ongoing, to which one of the older men confirmed. He stated that they were currently examining its effectiveness. They further explained to Bart that they had everything they needed, with only the interrogation regarding the manufacturing process remaining. Bart then drank the potion that Andreas and Lucia had prepared. As he sat down the bottle, he immediately recognized the individual ingredients and listed them out. When he finished, he turned to Lucia and asked if he was correct or if he had forgotten something. Lucia then added 2 more ingredients. Bart continued, mentioning at lightning speed that the 2 additional ingredients were very interesting. He praised her and said that he had already heard rumors about Lucia but hadn't believed she was capable of brewing such a good potion at her age. Bart then turned back to the committee and declared that the investigation was now concluded, as he would personally approve the potion. Bart flew high into the air and asked why Andreas Cromwell's son was here and what he had to do with the whole matter. Andreas became angry but kept his composure and remained silent. Bart considered that the paper submitted with the potion stated that Andreas and Lucia had worked together. However, he straightforwardly asked if Andreas was just being carried along. Andreas remained calm and said nothing. Lucia looked over at her friend but initially remained silent. A few seconds passed, and then she explained that she wouldn't have been able to brew the potion without his help. Bart couldn't believe what he heard and cautiously asked once again if what he had just heard was true. Lucia confirmed it once more and said that he had done most of the work and she had basically served as his assistant. Bart accepted this statement but still wanted to confirm it personally. He snapped his fingers, and another orange circle appeared around them. Andreas was astonished that even in this situation, before they were teleported and under tremendous pressure. Lucia attempted to analyze the magic and realized that Bart couldn't use magic outside the tower. Bart teleported with Andreas and Lucia to another room, where additional mages were working at tables with various magical devices, herbs, and roots. Bart wanted Andreas to prove that he had actually participated in developing the potion by making it here and now. He said that all the necessary ingredients were available in the storage and Andreas could freely use all the devices. Andrea understood and immediately got to work under the watchful eyes of Bart and the other curious mages. Andreas looked at the table with many different devices and avoided using one that he hadn't used before to avoid unnecessary attention. After 5 minutes, he was done, and Bart tried the potion Andreas had brewed. After the test, even the tower master had to admit and acknowledge Andreas's accomplishment. However, Bart then asked why Andreas had used Hong Pishi, for example. The room remained filled with tense anticipation as Bart, Andreas, and Lucia were observed by the other participants. Andreas answered Bart's questions in detail, explaining why he had chosen certain ingredients. The other mages and even Lucia were amazed that he could explain everything so well under such tremendous pressure. Bart interrupted Andreas, who wasn't finished with his explanation, and removed his brown eye covering. He said that, even though they hadn't seen each other for a while, he knew for sure that the boy from back then would never have been able to create something like this. He came close to Andreas, wanting to put additional pressure on him. Bart looked directly into Andreas' eyes with his blue eyes and asked him directly who he really was. Lucia was puzzled by this question, and in eerie silence, the room filled. As Bart continued to stare at Andreas. At first, Andreas remained silent, but then he grinned and replied in a questioning manner if this was a joke from Uncle Bart telling him that he was 100% Andreas Cromwell. The same Andreas whom he had treated like a bug and made fun of. Bart was surprised by this unexpected response and had to admit that Andreas had undergone quite an interesting character development. Bart was confident and grinned. He wanted to make a bet with Andreas. Andreas listened intently, curious about what it would entail. When Bart then proposed that he would pay off the entire debts of the Cromwell family if Andreas invented a new medicine by the end of the year, Andreas was surprised. After blindfolding himself again, Bart continued that he would also grant him a wish. However, if Andreas couldn't invent a new medicine and lost the bet, he would have to leave the academy. Andreas and Lucia were astonished by the conditions of the bet. Bart then asked him what he thought of the bet and if he agreed to it. Andreas looked at him and had to admit that the conditions were indeed very challenging, but he bowed to Bart and graciously accepted the bet despite the tough terms. As the head of the Cromwell family, he couldn't simply ignore such an offer and let such an opportunity slip away. Bart told him that he hoped Andreas would truly produce something since he possessed such confidence. He saw his father's face in him through his blindfold, which reminded him that they had a good relationship, and he was eager to see the results that Andreas would bring him. The final seconds of Angela's evolution came to an end, and she slowly regained her strength and ability to move. She pushed herself up, and her body was surrounded by an eerie purple mana. Angela looked at her wrist, which was still bound. However, after her evolution, she could easily break these restraints and shattered them into 1,000 pieces with a flick of her hand. With another motion, she also destroyed her cage and half of Sharon and Andreas's secret laboratory. She gazed at the devastation she had caused so effortlessly, and then she remembered Andreas and her vow not to harm him, as he wanted her to swear on the name of her family. She began to smile, and more images of Andreas filled her mind. Her smile grew more intense, and she couldn't wait to meet him again. Anticipation already burned in her eyes. After completing his duties at the Mage Tower, Andreas set off to the city to run a few errands. He had received some reimbursement for the material costs of his potion, so he no longer had the financial troubles he had at the beginning. His potions were so profitable that he contemplated focusing entirely on his training without having to worry about how to make money. Andreas' main problem at the moment was the pages of sloth that he had given to Nickel and stored in the interdimensional space for him. No matter how intensely Andreas thought about what he could do with those pages to gain a direct advantage, he couldn't come up with any ideas. So, he considered whether he could possibly trade them for something that could help him. At the moment, he didn't really want to take that step, but he couldn't think of anything else but to use his mentor Sharon to exchange the pages for something meaningful. The train Andreas was on came to a halt, and he got off, making his way back to the academy. He walked slowly, noticing something. He knew he was being watched. He looked around but couldn't spot any observer. Eventually, Andreas stood before the gate of Karen's estate. He was still suspicious and knew he was being watched, but he continued entering the estate, telling himself that he was probably just imagining things. Meanwhile, Angela was sitting on a tree, eagerly awaiting Andreas. She laughed and was genuinely excited to see him again. Both Sharon and Andreas were sitting in the lounge area of Karen's living room, and Sharon remarked that finally, the hot topic of the academy had come to visit him. Sharon examined the potion Andreas had brewed and asked if this was the infamous potion that had garnered so much attention alongside his midterm exam. Andreas confirmed this and told him that he had come straight to him after the final examination by the Mage Tower was completed. However, Sharon was not pleased that Andreas had secretly conducted research on a potion without his knowledge, and now had the audacity to act as if he were his student trying to flatter him. Andreas, however, did not confirm this and said that it was not his intention. Sharon was angry and told him to keep his mouth shut and follow him. He took a book from a shelf and used it to open a secret portal to his cellar, their research laboratory. Before Sharon and Andreas went through the portal, Sharon made it clear that he wanted to show him and engrave in him what it meant to become his student. Andreas couldn't believe that he would hold a grudge against him for such a trivial matter and found Sharon to be miserly. As the two went through the portal and descended a narrow corridor with a few stairs, with Sharon leading the way and generating a blue light using his magic. Andreas noticed that Sharon was in such a bad mood that he couldn't mention the pages of sloth. Today Andreas knew well that it was best not to talk to Sharon when he was in a bad mood. He decided to settle for reaching the laboratory and finding out Angela's status. When Sharon and Andreas reached the end of the stairs, flames and smoke greeted them. Sharon was taken aback as he looked into the antechamber of his lab, which resembled a battlefield. Everything was completely destroyed, and Andreas and Sharon stood there petrified, looking at the devastation before them. Andreas's eyes widened, and he thought that Angela's transformation, thanks to him, had been a resounding success. They then approached the cage where Angela was being held captive. Andreas reflected on the fact that it was a shame he couldn't talk to her again since she was a genuinely nice person. Sharon grabbed the chains that held Angela captive and cursed loudly. His anger grew, and his mood continued to deteriorate. He called out Andreas's name, to which Andreas simply replied with, "Yes." Angered, Sharon looked back at him and asked if he had done anything to Angela or her restraints. Andreas then lied and told him that he hadn't done anything, and he even feared for his own well-being if he approached the cage. Meanwhile, he thought to himself what an idiot Sharon was. Sharon straightened up and rose to his feet. He couldn't believe that a vampire, even if she was just a hybrid, had escaped from him. Andreas had to suppress his laughter and could only watch as Sharon held the remnants of their chains in his hands, both unbelieving and furious. Enraged, Sharon let out a scream. The screams of his anger were so loud that they could be heard even through the narrow staircase they had come down from, all the way to the top. It was late at night, and the blue moons had risen in the sky. Andreas made his way to his dormitory, deciding to bring up the topic of the pages of sloth on another day. As he walked under the trees along the street, red hair suddenly appeared above him. He was completely startled when, just a few milliseconds later, his name was called. He didn't move and realized that Angela was waiting for him, trying to lure him into a trap. Her right hand slowly moved around Andreas' neck as she asked him to answer a question she had since waking up. He was frozen, not moving, as he knew that any wrong move would prompt her to hurt him without hesitation. Angela told him to look at her, which he obediently did. She asked him to tell her everything about the ability she suddenly possessed. However, Andreas didn't answer her question. Instead, he countered with a question of his own, asking why she was doing this to him. He also asked if she hadn't kept her word, considering they had made a deal. She should think about the price she would have to pay if she broke her word and harmed him. Angela remained quiet for a moment and used some magic to hover in the air while one of her hands remained dangerously close to Andreas' body. She said that she knew perfectly well what the price was, but she couldn't help herself as she desperately needed to ask something. She told him that no matter how hard she had tried to break the chains that bound her, she had never succeeded on her own. So, she explained that she had found another way and asked if he knew it and what incredibly amazing method she had used. As she approached Andreas, she realized that he had a certain scent, almost like a great sin. Her eyes grew redder, and she told him that she finally understood. Andreas looked at Angela, completely unaware of what she was talking about. She said that he was very interesting and slowly ran her hand over Andreas' face. Then she asked him what they were just talking about. When he asked her that, she grabbed him by the throat, pushed him backward, and slammed him forcefully against a tree, causing a few leaves to fall. Andreas gasped for air, but Angela held him firmly against the tree. She told him that there were still plenty of things she wanted to ask him, but this place they were in was too obvious. So she wanted to stop attracting attention for now and leave it at that. Andreas was still struggling against her grip, but Angela told him that they would see each other again very soon. She also mentioned that she would use her newfound power in the meantime and surely find a good use for it. Furthermore, she couldn't help but thank Andreas for helping her. Andreas continued to try and free himself from her grasp, unable to believe the strength behind it. However, Angela reassured him that he shouldn't worry and that she wouldn't torture him. She licked her sharp teeth with her saliva-wetted tongue and told him that they were connected by fate. The next day at the Delusion dormitory, which looked almost regularly beautiful from the outside and was adorned with the typical golden and blue accents of the academy, the warm sun shone on a small terrace on the side of the building. Two women were sitting on the terrace enjoying their afternoon tea, pointed to a night in a book and enthusiastically told her friend a few stories about this night. The table was set with very exquisite tableware as her friend Julik was already on the verge of tears, asking Dane to take a moment's pause, dying, then told Julik that if she kept her eyes open enough she would surely find a knight to admire as well. Julik casually asked during their conversation if Dane had heard that Lucia Everlast had passed the examination of the Magic Tower Committee. Dane was amazed that she had achieved this despite her young age. She recalled hearing that Lucia was always lazy and sleeping during classes, but had to admit based on the current news that she was indeed a sleeping dragon who had it all figured out. Surprised, she wondered why she hadn't achieved something similar when she was in her first year. However, Julik said that wasn't even the most Surprising part, she lifted her tray and showed Dying an article on it featuring Andreas and Lucia along with two magicians from the tower announcing their discovery of the new potion. Julik asked,